My father once said the Atlantic used to belong to contrast. A submarine captain only needed a dark silhouette against a pale strip of sky. That was enough. Years later, in Royal Canadian Navy and National Research Council files, I found it wasn't just memory. It was documented, tested, preserved in official records I've listed in the description. What shifted that balance wasn't the bigger weapon. It was an idea that changed how the night worked. Here's a story.
Somewhere in the North Atlantic, past midnight, the sea is black and the sky barely lighter. A German U-boat commander presses his face to the periscope housing, scanning the horizon where a Canadian corvette should be. He sees nothing. The ocean, as far as the glass can reach, is empty. Then the depth charges come. Eruptions of white water hammer the pressure hull. The escort was right there, within striking distance. He never saw it. How did a warship disappear in open water? By 1940, the night belonged to the submarine, not by accident, but by physics. The Atlantic sky, even on the darkest nights, was never truly black. Starlight, diffused moonlight, the faint glow of high-altitude atmospheric scatter, all of it created a luminous ceiling above the water. It was dim, barely perceptible to the naked eye, but it was always there. And against that faint background, any solid object on the surface became a silhouette. A warship, no matter how low its profile, was a darker shape against a lighter canvas. The hull absorbed light. The superstructure blocked it. The funnels, the masts, the gun platforms, all of them interrupted the gradient of the sky and carved a recognizable outline into the visual field. From the conning tower of a surfaced U-boat or through the narrow lens of a periscope, this contrast was enough. It was more than enough. It was a targeting solution. German submarine commanders understood this intimately. Their tactical doctrine depended on it. The Wolfpack strategy devised by Admiral Karl Dönitz was built around a core principle. One U-boat would shadow a convoy and summon others by radio, and then the group would attack, generally on the surface at night. Submarines would not lurk below and fire blindly. They would surface under the cover of darkness, run at speed on their diesels, and close with the convoy from the dark side, the side where no moonlight fell, where the sky behind them was at its deepest. The attack developed in accordance with local conditions, coming at night and preferably from the convoy's dark side, which allowed the subs to approach against a totally black sky, while the convoy lay silhouetted against moonlight. From this angle, the escorts and merchant ships were etched against the brighter horizon. Their shapes were unmistakable: the broad beam of a tanker, the squat profile of a flower-class corvette, the taller stack of a destroyer. These outlines were visible at ranges of several thousand yards, sometimes more, depending on conditions. A commander could identify a target, estimate its speed and heading, calculate a firing solution, and launch torpedoes without ever diving, without ever coming within ASDIC range, without the target ever knowing the submarine was there. The best results came from attacks at night, made from the surface. U-boats were very slow underwater, but at the surface the Type 7 U-boats could approach 18 knots, which was twice the speed of many convoys, and sometimes proved faster than the escort vessels. This was not a limitation they endured. It was a weapon they wielded. The submarine on the surface was faster than its prey and nearly invisible, a low gray shape sitting just above the waterline, presenting almost no radar return with the early detection equipment in use during 1940 and 1941. The geometry was devastating. The escorts looked outward and saw nothing because the submarine's silhouette was negligible against the dark sea. The submarines looked inward and saw everything because the convoy's silhouette was enormous against the luminous sky. The night did not merely favor the attacker. It designed the entire tactical framework around the attacker's advantage. This led to a series of successful pack attacks on Allied convoys in the latter half of 1940, known as the happy time to the U-boat men. Commanders like Otto Kretschmer, Joachim Schepke, and Günther Prien operated with an almost surgical confidence. Otto Kretschmer and many other commanders preferred the dangerous tactic of heading straight into the center of a convoy and hitting ship after ship as they sailed past. They picked their targets. They chose their angles. They fired and withdrew, reloaded and returned. On certain nights, a single submarine could account for half a dozen merchant ships before dawn. The escorts were not passive. They carried depth charges, they had ASDIC, they maneuvered aggressively. But ASDIC required the submarine to be submerged, and the submarines were not submerging. Sonar only worked when the submarine was submerged, but U-boats routinely operated on the surface at night. The depth charges were a weapon of response, launched after a torpedo had already found its mark, after the explosion, after the fire, after the screaming. The escorts were reacting to damage already done, and the root of the problem was simple. The escorts could not see the submarines, but the submarines could see the escorts. Every night, for months, the Atlantic sorted itself into hunters and hunted, and darkness decided which was which. The silhouette was not merely a visual artifact. It was the foundation of a killing system. It gave the submarine commander range estimation. It gave him aspect identification. It gave him confidence. And confidence, in the black waters of the mid-Atlantic, was the most dangerous weapon of all. The question hanging over every escort commander, every convoy commodore, every analyst at Western approaches was not how to sink more submarines. That was a separate problem. The immediate desperate question was how to stop being seen. Like and subscribe to support more true wartime intelligence stories. The Royal Canadian Navy entered the Second World War with almost nothing, beginning the war with a mere 13 vessels and 3,500 personnel. The Royal Canadian Navy grew to become one of the largest navies in the world. There were no aircraft carriers, no cruiser squadrons, no established doctrine for fleet warfare on the scale that was about to unfold. Canada's naval identity, such as it was, had been shaped by decades of austerity, political indifference, and the quiet stubbornness of a small cadre of officers who refused to let the service die entirely during the interwar years. When Germany invaded Poland in September 1939, the RCN's operational fleet consisted of a handful of destroyers and a scattering of auxiliary vessels. Within weeks, the demands of the war would expose the gulf between what Canada had and what the Atlantic required. The convoys had to move. The supplies had to flow. Britain's survival depended on an unbroken chain of merchant ships stretching from Halifax, and Sydney and St. John's to Liverpool, to Glasgow, to the Clyde, and someone had to protect those ships. The solution came in the form of the Corvette. The Corvette was the workhorse of the Battle of the Atlantic, a small escort warship that was lightly armed but still packed a punch, with 85 crew and a length of 208 feet, making 16 knots. Quick and inexpensive to build, many shipyards across Canada produced them, with 123 of them serving the RCN over the course of the war. They were based on a commercial whaler design. They were not glamorous. They were not fast, could carry depth charges and ASDIC, and A could carry depth charges and ASDIC and a 4-inch gun, and they could go to sea. And go to sea they did, endlessly. The Canadian corvettes became the spine of the mid-ocean escort, the small, rolling, perpetually wet ships that shepherded convoys through the most dangerous stretch of the Atlantic. Service on flowers in the North Atlantic was typically cold, wet, monotonous, and uncomfortable. Every dip of the forecastle into an oncoming wave was followed by a cascade of water into the well-deck amidships. Men at action stations were drenched with spray, and water entered living spaces through hatches opened for access to ammunition magazines. Interior decks were constantly wet, and condensation dripped from the overheads. Life aboard a corvette was an exercise in endurance. The ships pitched violently in any kind of sea. The mess decks were cramped and airless, stinking of diesel and damp wool and stale food. Sleep came in snatches, interrupted by alarms, by the thunder of depth charges, by the sickening lurch of the hull as the bow climbed a wave and fell into the trough behind it. The crews were young, many of them reservists or volunteers, men who had been clerks and farmers and fishermen weeks before. They learned their trade on the ocean, in winter, in the dark. Fought largely by reservists in small ships built in Canada and operating from Canadian bases, the defense of North Atlantic trade against the submarine menace defined a naval role for Canada within a much larger alliance. The convoys sailed from Halifax and Sydney, Nova Scotia, gathering merchant ships from ports along the Canadian coast and assembling them into columns. Then the escorts took over. A typical group might consist of 1 destroyer and 4 or 5 corvettes, responsible for protecting 30, 40, sometimes 50 merchant ships spread across miles of ocean. The numbers were never enough. At the end of 1941, senior officers warned that men in ships were being tested beyond their limits, with too little and inadequate equipment, insufficient training, and too little time to recover. The escorts were stretched thin, their equipment often inferior to what the Royal Navy carried, their crews exhausted by back-to-back crossings with no time for refit or rest. And the losses were staggering. Although only 30% of transatlantic convoys between July and the end of 1942 were Canadian escorted, virtually all of them were slow, and they suffered 80% of Allied losses in the mid-ocean over the period. The British were quick to blame Canadian incompetence, but without good radar and Huff Duff to provide solid tactical intelligence, the RCN fought blindly. The problem was not courage. The problem was not seamanship. The problem was that Canadian ships sailed into the mid-Atlantic gap with outdated radar, without shipborne HF/DF, and without the 10-centimeter sets that were already transforming the Royal Navy's ability to detect surfaced submarines. The centimetric radar development was such a technical breakthrough that Canada's NRC was unable to come up rapidly with a Canadian version. The RCN would benefit from this upgrade only in 1943 and 1944, long after its British counterpart. They were, in the most, the literal sense, fighting blind. The convoys moved through darkness, surrounded by submarines they could not detect, waiting for the first torpedo explosion to tell them the attack had already begun. The Canadian Corvette crews knew what the dark meant. It meant torpedoes. It meant fire on the water. It meant pulling survivors from oil-slicked seas in temperatures that killed within minutes. It meant watching a merchant ship break apart and sink in less time than it took to turn the helm. And it meant doing it all again the next night, and the night after that, for weeks on end, knowing that the submarines could see them long before they could see the submarines. The darkness was not neutral. It was a German weapon, and Canada, with its tiny navy and its rolling corvettes and its undertrained crews, was losing to it. The human eye is a remarkable instrument, but it operates within strict physical limits. In darkness, the pupil dilates to gather what little light remains. The retina shifts from cone-mediated color vision to rod-mediated scotopic perception, a mode optimized for detecting contrast rather than detail. In the open Atlantic at night, the eye's primary task was not to see objects in color or with sharpness, but to detect differences in brightness, edges, boundaries. The line where one darkness ended and another began. This is why the silhouette was so deadly. A ship at sea, observed from a low angle, the angle of a submarine's periscope or a surfaced conning tower, presented itself against the background of the sky near the horizon. Even on moonless nights, that sky carried a faint luminance. Starlight, scattered by the atmosphere, produced a glow that was invisible to a casual observer on land, but unmistakable to a trained eye at sea, especially an eye that had been dark adapted for 20 or 30 minutes. Against that dim glow, the ship was a void. Its steel hull absorbed light. Its paint, however carefully chosen, reflected almost nothing at night. The superstructure was a dark mass. The funnel was a dark column. The masts were dark lines. The overall shape was an irregular block of blackness against a slightly less black sky, and the human eye, in scotopic mode, was exquisitely tuned to detect precisely that kind of contrast. The range at which a ship became visible as a silhouette depended on several variables. The brightness of the sky, which changed with moon phase, cloud cover, and atmospheric conditions. The size and profile of the ship, larger vessels being visible at greater ranges. The height of the observer, a man standing on a conning tower having a wider visual arc than one at periscope depth. And the sharpness of the contrast boundary, a clean horizon producing a more defined silhouette than one broken by waves or haze. Under favorable conditions, a corvette could be detected as a silhouette at ranges of 3,000 to 5,000 yards. A large merchant ship might be visible at even greater distances. And critically, the observer did not need to identify the ship. He merely needed to detect its presence. A dark shape against a lighter background, at a known bearing, moving at a consistent rate, was enough to initiate an approach. A Type 7 submarine commander, running on the surface at 15 knots, could close from 5,000 yards to torpedo range in a matter of minutes. The escort commanders understood the physics even if they lacked the vocabulary. They knew that the submarines could see them from angles where they could not see the submarines. They knew that the standard wartime blackout, designed to hide ships from aircraft, actually made the problem worse, not better. A blacked-out ship was darker than a partially lit one, and a darker ship produced a sharper silhouette against the sky. This was the paradox. The instinct was to turn off every light, to make the ship as dark as possible, to hide in the night. But hiding in the night was impossible because the night sky itself was the betrayer. No matter how dark the ship, the sky behind it was lighter, and the contrast, that narrow band of difference between hull and horizon, was all the submarine needed. The paint schemes helped marginally. Various shades of gray, carefully chosen to approximate the average brightness of the sea surface, could reduce contrast under certain conditions. Camouflage patterns designed to break up the ship's outline had some effect at medium ranges, but at night, paint was essentially useless. The human eye in scotopic vision does not register color, it registers luminance, and no paint in existence could make a steel hull glow with the brightness of the sky behind it. The problem was fundamental. It was not a matter of better tactics or different formations or more aggressive depth charge patterns. It was a problem of physics. The ship was darker than the sky. The eye detected the difference. The torpedo followed. And until someone addressed the physics, the submarines would continue to hold the night. Somewhere in Canada, someone was about to address the physics. But the answer would not come from a naval officer or a weapons designer. It would come from an electrical engineer watching an airplane. The idea arrived by accident on a December night in 1940 near Montreal. Edmund Godfrey Burr, a Canadian professor at McGill University, had been tasked by Canada's National Research Council to evaluate night observation instruments. His work was not glamorous. It involved standing in the cold, peering through binoculars and prototype optical devices, cataloging what the human eye could and could not detect under various nighttime conditions. He was not designing weapons. He was studying visibility. With these instruments, he found that aircraft flying without navigation lights remained readily visible as silhouettes against the night sky, which was never completely black. Burr wondered if he could camouflage planes by somehow reducing this difference in brightness. The observation was straightforward, but its implications were significant. If darkened aircraft were visible against a dim sky, then darkened ships were visible against a dim sky. The blackout was not a solution. It was part of the problem. Then came the moment that changed everything. On the night of December 4th, 1940, a sudden and unexpected demonstration of this idea occurred by chance. A plane that Burr was observing in flight through his binoculars disappeared suddenly as it approached for landing. Burr deduced that this phenomenon could be explained by the fact that the area surrounding the airport was covered in freshly fallen snow, and that the light from the moon reflecting off this white surface had illuminated the underside of the plane's fuselage while it was flying at low altitude. This diffused lighting had eliminated the contrast in luminosity between the plane and the sky, rendering the aircraft invisible to Burr's eyes. The aircraft had not cloaked itself. It had not become transparent. It had simply stopped being darker than its background. The reflected moonlight on the snow-covered ground had bounced upward and illuminated the plane's belly just enough that its brightness matched the sky above it. The contrast vanished, and when the contrast vanished, the eye lost the target. Burr understood immediately what he had witnessed. Not a trick of perception, but a principle of physics that could be deliberately engineered. If light, applied to the underside or the sides of an object, could raise its brightness to match the background, then the object would cease to cast a visual silhouette. It would not become invisible in the absolute sense, but it would become undetectable to an observer relying on contrast to find it. Professor Burr immediately informed the National Research Council of his discovery, who in turn conveyed it to the Canadian Naval Service's headquarters. In 1940, diffused lighting seemed to offer an alternative solution to the problem of visual disadvantage. It could make a convoy as difficult to see from a U-boat as it was to see a U-boat from a convoy. The idea, when it reached the naval staff, must have sounded absurd. The entire defensive doctrine of the war at sea was built around darkness and concealment. Ships ran blacked out. Crews were forbidden from lighting cigarettes on deck. portholes were sealed. Even the glow of a compass binnacle was considered a risk. And now, a professor from McGill was proposing to put lights on the outside of warships, not searchlights, not signal lamps, not anything intended to illuminate the sea or the enemy. Lamps aimed inward at the ship's own hull, designed to make the hull glow, designed to make the ship brighter. Scarcely a few days after having reported his discovery, Professor Burr was invited to Naval Services headquarters to discuss the possible applications of this technique. Laboratory tests quickly demonstrated that the basic principle was valid. In the laboratory, the results were striking. A scale model of a ship, illuminated from the sides to match the brightness of a simulated background, became dramatically harder to detect. The eye, deprived of the contrast it depended on, simply stopped registering the object. It was still there. It had not moved. It had not changed shape. But the visual system could no longer separate it from its surroundings. The principle was borrowed from nature, though Burr may not have known it at the time. An equivalent strategy, known to zoologists as counter-illumination, is used by many marine organisms, notably cephalopods, including the midwater squid. The underside is covered with small photophores, organs that produce light. The squid varies the intensity of the light according to the brightness of the sea surface far above, providing effective camouflage by lighting out the animal's shadow. Deep-sea creatures had been doing this for millions of years, erasing their own silhouettes by matching the brightness above them. Burr had stumbled onto the same trick, applied to steel instead of flesh. The question was whether it could work on a real ship, in a real ocean, against a real enemy. The laboratory was controlled. The Atlantic was not. Salt spray, wind, wave action, variable sky conditions, the constant vibration of a moving vessel, all of these would conspire against any delicate optical system mounted on the outside of a corvette. But the losses were mounting. The U-boats were killing ships faster than the Allies could build them, and the night was the enemy's territory. If there was even a chance that the principle could work, it had to be tried. The decision was made. Canada would attempt to build the strangest weapon of the war. Not a gun, not a bomb, not a torpedo. A set of lights designed to make a warship fade into the sky. The decision was then taken to proceed in January 1941 with a first trial on a Canadian Navy ship, the Corvette HMCS Cobalt. The engineering challenge was immense. The concept was simple in principle, but nightmarish in execution. To make a ship's hull match the brightness of the night sky, you had to illuminate the hull evenly, from stem to stern, on both sides, without creating hot spots or dark patches that would themselves become detectable. The light had to be diffused, soft, spread across the metal surface in a uniform wash. It had to be adjustable because the brightness of the sky changed constantly, with every passing cloud, every shift in the moon's angle, every variation in atmospheric conditions. And it had to survive the North Atlantic. In January 1941, sea trials began on the new Corvette HMCS Cobalt. She was fitted with ordinary light projectors, neither designed for robustness nor waterproofed, on temporary supports on one side of the hull, with brightness controlled, and manually. The trial was sufficiently promising for a better prototype to be developed. The first installation was crude. Commercial light projectors, the kind used for display lighting or theatrical work, were mounted on small platforms bolted to the hull. They pointed inward toward the ship's side, casting their beams across the steel plating. There was no automatic control. A sailor watched the sky and the hull and turned a dial, trying to match one to the other by eye. The projectors were not waterproofed. The supports were temporary. The entire system was a lash-up, held together by ingenuity and urgency. But it worked, not perfectly, not reliably, not in all conditions. But observers stationed at various distances from HMCS Cobalt, simulating the view from a submarine, reported that the ship's visibility was significantly reduced when the lamps were operating. The dark silhouette softened. The hard edge between hull and sky blurred. In certain light conditions, the Corvette became genuinely difficult to detect. The second version, with blue-green filters over the projectors, was trialed on board the Corvette HMCS Chambly in May 1941. This gave better results as the filters removed the reddish bias to the lamps when at low intensity. The supports, too, were retractable, so the delicate projectors could be stowed away for protection when not in use. the filters were a key refinement. Ordinary incandescent lamps, when dimmed, shifted their color temperature toward the red end of the spectrum. The night sky, however, carried a blue-gray hue. A reddish glow on the hull, even at low intensity, would stand out against a blue-gray background, creating a different kind of contrast. Not brightness, but color. The blue-green filters compensated for this shift, bringing the lamp output into closer alignment with the sky's spectral characteristics. The ship's glow, when properly filtered, began to approximate not just the brightness, but the tone of the night around it. The third version featured a photocell to measure the brightness of the night sky and the ship's side, and the projector's brightness was automatically controlled to balance out the difference. It was tested in September 1941 on the Corvette HMCS Kamloops. This was a critical advance. A photocell mounted on the ship's superstructure measured the ambient light level of the sky. A second sensor measured the brightness of the illuminated hull. An electrical circuit compared the two readings and adjusted the lamp output to minimize the difference. The system was, in effect, a feedback loop, a primitive computer that continuously recalculated the correct brightness and drove the lamps to match it. Energy consumption was substantial, requiring a dedicated 3-kilowatt alternator on corvettes like HMCS Edmundston, which could consume 10 to 20% of a ship's electrical output during operation. This was not a trivial demand. Corvettes had limited generating capacity, and the electrical systems already powered ASDIC, radar, communications, and the ship's own lighting. Adding a 3-kilowatt load for hull illumination meant that something else had to give, or a new generator had to be fitted. The retractable supports solved another problem. At sea, any projecting equipment was vulnerable to damage from waves, ice, and the general battering of heavy weather. The lamp arrays, mounted on the hull sides, were exposed to exactly the conditions most likely to destroy them. By making the supports retractable, the researchers ensured that the lamps could be deployed for nighttime operations and stowed during daylight or in heavy seas. The system was growing more sophisticated with each iteration, but it was also growing more complex, more fragile, and more demanding of the ship's crew. Operating diffuse lighting camouflage was not like flipping a switch. It required monitoring, adjustment, and constant attention, in addition to all the other duties that kept a Corvette crew alive in the North Atlantic. Still, the principle held. Each test confirmed that controlled illumination of the hull could dramatically reduce a ship's visual signature. The physics worked. The question was whether the engineering could keep up with the ocean. The U.S. Navy sent its control system and diffused lighting fittings to Canada's NRC, which installed it on the corvettes HMCS Edmundston and HMCS Rimouski in 1943 and carried out further prototyping. Both Edmundston and Rimouski were fitted with about 60 light projectors. Those on the hull were on retractable supports. Those on the superstructure were on fixed supports. Each ship's diffused lighting system was tested systematically in St. Margaret's Bay, and then trialed when actually escorting Atlantic convoys in 1943. 60 projectors. Imagine the sight. A Flower-class corvette, barely 200 feet long, its hull already crowded with depth charge rails, gun platforms, radar antennae, and ventilators, now bristling with rows of small lamp housings on retractable arms. On the hull sides, the projectors pointed inward, washing the gray steel with a controlled glow. On the superstructure, fixed mounts aimed their beams downward and outward, illuminating the upper works where the funnel and bridge created the most prominent silhouette features. The testing in St. Margaret's Bay, off the coast of Nova Scotia, was methodical. Observer boats were stationed at measured distances, replicating the viewing angle and height of a submarine periscope. The corvettes steamed past at various speeds and headings, with the diffused lighting system activated and deactivated in alternating runs. Observers recorded the range at which they could first detect the ship, the range at which they lost visual contact when the lamps came on, and the subjective quality of the camouflage effect. Experimentally, the diffused lighting reduced the ship's visibility by up to 70%. 70%. That figure was extraordinary. It meant that a corvette that might normally become visible as a silhouette at 4,000 yards would not be detected until roughly 1,200 yards, a range at which the escort was already dangerously close to a submarine, close enough to prosecute, an ASDIC contact, close enough to drop depth charges, close enough to change the tactical equation entirely. The observers described the effect in careful, measured terms. When the lamps were off, the Corvette was a distinct dark shape, its outline clearly defined against the sky. When the lamps came on and the brightness was correctly matched, the shape softened, blurred, and in some cases appeared to dissolve into the background. The ship did not vanish absolutely. Under close scrutiny, a faint irregularity might be detected, a slight thickening of the horizon, a barely perceptible disruption in the smooth gradient of the sky. But at the ranges that mattered, the ranges at which a submarine commander made his approach decisions, the Corvette was effectively gone. Parallel trials of the Canadian diffuse lighting equipment were carried out in March 1941 by the Royal Navy on the Corvette HMS, Trillium in the Clyde approaches. The Admiralty report on the Trillium trials stated that, under certain weather conditions, the Canadian trials, in spite of the crude equipment used, gave highly satisfactory results. The Admiralty informed the Prime Minister, Winston Churchill, at the end of that month, stating that the results seemed quite promising. The results were promising enough that the idea crossed the Atlantic and attracted attention from both the Royal Navy and the United States Navy. Later, in 1941, the Royal Navy trialed the General Electric Company's manually operated diffuse lighting system on HMS Largs, and then halted the research. The U.S. Navy trialed an automatic system made by General Electric of New York in 1942, but soon also halted research. Only Canada persisted. Only Canada pushed the concept all the way to operational testing on active escort duty. But promising was not the same as proven. St. Margaret's Bay was sheltered water. The North Atlantic was not. And the submarines that would judge the system's effectiveness were not patient observers. With clipboards, they were killers with torpedoes. Somewhere in the autumn of 1943, a Canadian corvette left port with something new aboard. Not a weapon, not a sensor, not a piece of communications equipment that would be familiar to any sailor in the fleet. Instead, she carried 60 lamp projectors mounted on her hull and superstructure, a dedicated electrical alternator to power them, photocells to read the brightness of the sky, and a control system designed to make her sides glow with the exact luminance of the night behind her. She joined her escort group and took station around a convoy. The merchant ships formed their columns, the familiar pattern of the Atlantic crossing, dark shapes spread across miles of ocean, heading east. The escorts fanned out to their positions, the corvettes on the flanks, the destroyer ahead, the pattern that every veteran of the mid-ocean run knew by instinct. As darkness fell, the crew of the fitted corvette prepared the diffuse lighting system. The retractable projectors were extended, locking into position along the hull. The superstructure lamps were uncovered. The photocells began their readings, sampling the ambient light of the sky and feeding the data to the control circuits. Slowly, carefully, the lamps came to life. Not with a sudden blaze, but with a gradual brightening, a gentle wash of blue-green light that crept across the steel plating until the hull was no longer dark. From the bridge, the effect was almost invisible. Looking outward, nothing had changed. The sea was black. The convoy was dark. The horizon was a thin line of faintly luminous sky. But from out there, from the position of a submarine approaching from the dark side, the corvette was performing an act of optical deception that had no precedent in naval warfare. Where there should have been a silhouette, a solid dark shape against the sky, there was now something harder to categorize. A ship-sized area of the horizon that did not quite resolve into anything definite. The hard edge between hull and sky had softened. The contrast that the eye depended on to detect and identify the target had been reduced to the threshold of perception. These trials demonstrated effective background matching on the clear, moonless nights, with the ship remaining undetected until approximately 2,250 yards during evaluations. That was close. That was the kind of range where a submarine commander would normally already be inside the escort screen, lined up and firing. But if the escort was invisible until that range, the window for attack had been compressed drastically. The submarine would have seconds instead of minutes. The approach would have to be nearly perfect. The margin for error would be gone. Consider what this meant for the tactical geometry. A submarine commander, scanning the horizon, would expect to pick up the escort at several thousand yards. He would use that early detection to plan his approach, to choose the gap in the screen, to estimate the escort's speed and heading. With diffused lighting, that early warning was gone. The escort might be anywhere. The gap that looked clear might not be clear at all. The darkness that seemed empty might contain a warship already closing at 12 knots, already turning toward the submarine's position, already preparing to drop depth charges. The psychological effect was as significant as the tactical one. A submarine commander who trusted his eyes was a confident attacker. A submarine commander who could not trust his eyes was a cautious one. Caution meant longer approach times, wider margins, aborted attacks. Every aborted attack was a convoy saved. The Corvette made her crossing, the lamps hummed, the sea moved, and somewhere in the darkness, a submarine commander may have scanned the horizon and seen nothing where a warship should have been. German U-boat war diaries from 1943 present a fragmentary picture, as they always do. Submarine commanders recorded what they saw and what they did, but rarely what they failed to see. The absence of a contact was not a notable event. A night spent scanning empty horizon produced no entry, no annotation, no record of the opportunity that did not arise. This is the nature of defensive camouflage. Its success is measured in things that did not happen. But the operational record carries indirect evidence of growing uncertainty. By the middle of 1943, the Battle of the Atlantic was shifting. The causes were multiple: radar, HF/DF, ultra-intelligence, longer-range aircraft, better training, more escorts, and it is impossible to isolate the contribution of any single factor. But somewhere in the mix, there are indicators that the night was becoming less predictable for the submarines. Approach times lengthened, detection ranges compressed. Commanders who once closed with convoys on the surface, confident in their invisibility, began reporting that escorts seemed to appear with less warning. Contacts that should have been detected at range materialized at distances that left little time to react. In September 1943, Rimouski, using her diffused lighting system, but also some navigation lights, approached German submarine U-536 in the Baie de Chaleur. The intention was to make Rimouski appear as a small and inoffensive ship in an operation to trap the submarine, and this appears to have worked as the U-boat did not detect her. However, the attack failed as a wrong signal sent from shore alerted the submarine's commander, Captain Lieutenant Schauenberg, who dived and escaped. The incident in the Baie de Chaleur is the closest thing to a documented operational test under combat conditions. HMCS Rimouski, carrying her full complement of 60 diffused lighting projectors, deliberately approached a known submarine position using her camouflage system to mask her identity. The submarine did not detect her approach. The visual deception worked. The U-boat commander, scanning the water, either failed to see the Corvette or dismissed what he saw as something harmless. The attack failed for unrelated reasons, a procedural error on shore that tipped off the submarine. But the camouflage itself performed exactly as intended. Rimouski closed to engagement range without being identified as a warship. U-536 was sunk 2 months later by the Canadian corvettes Naney and Snowberry on November 19, 1943, while she was attacking a convoy. The broader question, whether diffused lighting camouflage affected the statistical outcome of convoy battles, cannot be answered with the available data. The number of ships fitted was too small, the deployment window too brief, and the operational variables too numerous to permit a controlled comparison. What can be said is that the system was tested under operational conditions, and that, where records exist, it performed within the parameters predicted by the laboratory and at sea trials. The German response, or lack of one, is itself informative. There is no evidence that German naval intelligence identified diffused lighting camouflage as a specific threat or developed countermeasures against it. This may simply reflect the small scale of the program, but it may also reflect the nature of the deception itself. A submarine commander who failed to see an escort did not know he had failed. He would not report a ship that was not there. He would simply note an uneventful patrol sector, an empty horizon, a night without contacts. The camouflage succeeded precisely by leaving no trace in the enemy's record. The uncertainty was real, even if it was diffuse. Night attacks were becoming riskier. The escort seemed harder to track. The reliable geometry of silhouette and approach was eroding. Some of this was radar, some was improved tactics, and some, on certain nights, on certain sectors, may have been a corvette. glowing softly in the dark, matching the sky, erasing her own shadow, waiting. The physics of diffuse lighting camouflage is deceptively simple. It rests on a single principle. The human visual system detects objects primarily through contrast. Contrast, in this context, is the difference in luminance between an object and its background. If an object is significantly brighter or darker than its surroundings, it produces a high contrast boundary that the eye can detect at range. If the luminance difference is small, the boundary becomes faint, and the detection range shrinks. If the luminance difference is zero, the boundary vanishes entirely, and the object becomes invisible to the naked eye, regardless of its size, shape, or proximity. This is not invisibility in the science fiction sense. The object is still there. It still reflects light, still occupies space, still blocks the view of whatever lies behind it. But the visual system, which operates by detecting edges and gradients, cannot find the edge. The processing that converts raw photon data into perceived objects fails at the first step, because the first step is edge detection, and there is no edge to detect. At night, the relevant background is the sky near the horizon. This sky is never completely dark. Even on a moonless, overcast night, atmospheric scatter from distant city lights. Starlight, or the zodiacal glow, produces a faint luminance. The sea surface, by contrast, is very dark, absorbing most incident light. This means that any object on the sea surface, viewed from a low angle, appears against a background that is slightly brighter than the object itself. A ship's hull, painted in standard wartime gray, has a surface luminance that depends on the paint reflectivity and the incident light level. At night, with no artificial illumination, the hull receives almost no light and reflects almost none. It is effectively black. The sky behind it is not black. The result is a negative contrast boundary, a dark object against a less dark background. And this is precisely what the dark-adapted human eye is best at detecting. The diffuse lighting system attacked this contrast by raising the luminance of the hull. By projecting light onto the ship's sides, the system increased the hull's apparent brightness until it matched the sky. When the match was achieved, the contrast dropped to zero, or near zero, and the eye could no longer separate hull from sky. The concept behind diffuse lighting camouflage was to project light onto the sides of a ship to make its brightness match its background. Projectors were mounted on temporary supports attached to the hull, and the prototype was developed to include automatic control of brightness using a photocell. The photocell feedback loop was essential because the sky's brightness changed continuously. A passing cloud could dim the sky by a factor of 2 or more. The moon, rising or setting, produced gradual but significant shifts. The ship's heading relative to the moon or the brightest part of the sky affected which side required more illumination. Without automatic adjustment, the operator would be constantly chasing a moving target, and any mismatch, even a small one, would create enough contrast for a trained observer to detect. The spectral matching was equally important. The human eye at night, operating in scotopic mode, is most sensitive to wavelengths around 507 nanometers in the blue-green portion of the spectrum. The night sky's luminance is concentrated in a similar range. An incandescent lamp, however, emits a broad spectrum weighted toward the red. If the hull was illuminated with unfiltered light, it would appear warm-toned against a cool-toned sky, creating chromatic contrast even if the brightness levels matched. The blue-green filters corrected this, shifting the lamp output to approximate the spectral characteristics of the ambient sky. The result was a system that could, under optimal conditions, make a corvette effectively invisible to a submarine. Observer at tactically significant ranges, not permanently invisible, not universally invisible, but invisible enough for long enough to disrupt the targeting sequence that the entire U-boat night attack depended on. The science was elegant, the engineering was brutal, and the ocean, as always, had the final word. The North Atlantic was the worst possible environment for a system that depended on delicate optics, precise electrical control, and continuous calibration. The seas in the mid-ocean gap, where the convoys were most vulnerable, were among the harshest on Earth. Waves reached heights that sent green water crashing over the forecastle of a corvette. Wind-driven spray coated every exposed surface with salt. Temperatures hovered near freezing for months at a stretch, and the cycle of freezing and thawing turned salt deposits into a corrosive paste that attacked metal, glass, and electrical insulation with equal enthusiasm. The lamp projectors, mounted on the hull sides, bore the full brunt of this punishment. Despite the retractable supports, the projectors could not be permanently protected. They had to be deployed at night, when the seas were often at their worst. Waves slammed against the hull and deluged the lamp housings. Salt spray accumulated on the glass lenses, scattering the light and degrading the uniformity of the illumination. Ice formed on the supports, adding weight and stress to joints that were already strained by vibration. Experimentally, the diffused lighting reduced the ship's visibility by up to 70%, but at sea the electrical equipment proved too delicate and frequently malfunctioned. The failure modes were numerous. Bulbs burned out from the constant vibration of the hull. Wiring connections corroded. The photocells, which needed a clear view of the sky to function, became fouled with salt deposits or obscured by spray. The control circuits, designed for laboratory conditions, struggled with the electrical noise generated by the ship's other systems. Power fluctuations caused the lamps to flicker or shift in brightness, creating momentary contrast spikes that could betray the ship's position. The system's photocell-controlled lamps had a response time of several seconds to adjust to changing light conditions, limiting rapid maneuvers. This was a significant operational constraint. If the sky brightened suddenly, as when a cloud moved away from the moon, the lamps would lag behind, leaving the hull under-illuminated and the silhouette exposed for a critical interval. Conversely, if the sky darkened, the lamps would briefly over-illuminate the hull, making the ship glow brighter than its background and creating positive contrast, which was just as detectable as the negative contrast the system was designed to eliminate. The technology's effectiveness varied with weather conditions, performing best in calm, clear nights, but poorly in rough seas, overcast skies, or fog due to difficulties in maintaining uniform illumination and increased reflections. Fog was a particular problem. In foggy conditions, the lamps illuminated not just the hull, but the fog around the ship, creating a diffuse glow that was visible at range and announced the ship's presence rather than concealing it. Heavy rain had a similar effect, each raindrop becoming a tiny reflector that scattered the light outward. At sea, the electrical equipment proved too delicate and frequently malfunctioned. Worse, the system was slow to respond to changes in background lighting, and the Canadian Navy considered the lighting too green. The greenish tint was an artifact of the filters. The blue-green filters that improved spectral matching under clear skies gave the hull an unnatural hue under different atmospheric conditions. Observers reported that the overall tone of the illumination did not always blend convincingly with the ambient sky, particularly when the sky carried a gray or amber cast. Maintenance was relentless. After each crossing, the lamp housings had to be cleaned, the bulbs replaced, the wiring inspected, the photocells recalibrated. This added hours of work to an already exhausted crew and consumed supplies that were not easily obtained at forward bases like St. John's. A corvette returning from a convoy escort, with half her projectors burned out and her control circuits corroded, was not a ship that could turn around and sail again without significant repair time. The system worked. Under the right conditions, it worked remarkably well. But the right conditions were not the typical conditions of the North Atlantic, and a weapon that only functions on calm, clear nights in a theater defined by storms, fog, and relentless gray seas is a weapon with a narrow window of utility. The researchers knew this. The Navy knew this. And by 1943, other developments were about to make the question academic. Radar changed everything. The early radars that the Allies deployed were crude instruments. The first sets fitted to escort vessels, like the Canadian WWII, operated on metric wavelengths and could barely detect a surfaced submarine. Their performance was unreliable, their maintenance demanding, and their interpretation more art than science. But the principle was revolutionary. Radar did not depend on contrast. It did not depend on the human eye. It operated regardless of darkness, fog, rain, or sea state. It sent out a pulse of electromagnetic energy and measured what came back. British scientists developed the cavity magnetron that could reduce a radar wavelength to 10 centimeters. As early as 1941, Royal Navy vessels were equipped with this improved radar, Model 271. The 10-centimeter radar was a transformative technology. Its shorter wavelength produced a tighter beam and a higher resolution return, capable of detecting the small cross-section of a submarine's conning tower at ranges that the older metric sets could not approach. A surfaced U-boat, which had been essentially invisible to radar in 1940, became a detectable target in 1942, and a reliably trackable one by 1943. For the submarine, this was catastrophic. The entire nighttime attack doctrine depended on the assumption that the submarine could see the convoy before the convoy could see the submarine. Radar inverted this assumption. An escort equipped with 10-centimeter radar could detect a surfaced U-boat at several miles, well before the submarine's lookouts could make out the escort's silhouette. The hunter became the hunted. The implications for diffused lighting camouflage were immediate and unavoidable. The system had been designed to defeat visual detection. It addressed the human eye and the periscope. It was supremely effective against an observer who relied on contrast to find targets. But radar did not look for contrast. Radar looked for reflective surfaces. And a corvette's hull, whether illuminated or dark, returned the same radar echo. By 1943, radar advancements rendered submarines detectable, regardless of visual camouflage, as U-boat hunters increasingly relied on electronic means over periscope sightings. This did not make diffused lighting useless overnight. The shift from visual to electronic detection was gradual and uneven. Not all escorts carried 10-centimeter radar. Not all submarine approaches were intercepted by radar before visual contact. And there were tactical scenarios, close-range engagements, approaches in radar shadow zones, situations where radar was degraded by sea clutter, in which visual detection still mattered. In those situations, diffused lighting camouflage retained its value. But the trend was clear. The war at sea was moving from eyes to electronics. The future of anti-submarine warfare lay in radar, sonar, HF/DF, ultra-intelligence, and the coordinated application of technology that made the submarine's position known, regardless of what the human eye could or could not perceive. Following Allied victory in the Battle of the Atlantic, through longer-range aircraft, radar, code decryption, and better escort tactics, the need to camouflage ships from submarines greatly decreased and diffused lighting research became a low priority. The timing was bittersweet. Diffused lighting camouflage reached operational maturity just as the tactical landscape that made it necessary was being reshaped by technologies that made it redundant. The system answered a question that the war had already moved past, but it answered that question brilliantly, and the fact that radar overtook it does not diminish what it was. A precise, elegant, scientifically rigorous solution to a problem that was killing thousands of people. The reasons diffused lighting camouflage never went to fleet-wide deployment are practical, not philosophical. The concept was never put into production, though the Canadian prototypes did briefly see service. The system required approximately 60 lamp projectors per corvette, each with its own mounting, wiring, lens, and filter. It required a dedicated electrical generator. It required photocells, control circuits, and calibration equipment. It required trained operators who understood both the physics and the practical limitations of the system. And it required maintenance, constant, specialized maintenance in conditions that destroyed equipment as a matter of course. The cost was significant, not in absolute terms, but relative to the benefit. A Corvette fitted with diffused lighting camouflage was more expensive to build, more complex to maintain, and more demanding of its crew. And the benefit, while real under optimal conditions, was inconsistent and weather-dependent. A system that worked brilliantly on a clear, calm night, but failed in fog, rain, or heavy seas, was a system that could not be relied upon as a primary defense. There were also competing priorities. By 1943, the Allies were investing heavily in radar, in new escort types, in longer-range aircraft, in improved weapons like the Hedgehog, a head-throwing mortar. Every pound of weight, every hour of dockyard time, every kilowatt of electrical capacity allocated to diffused lighting was a resource not available for these other systems, and the other systems, particularly radar and HF/DF, were proving their value in convoy after convoy. The Royal Navy had already halted its own diffused lighting research. The U.S. Navy had done the same. The Canadian ideas were, however, adapted by the U.S. Air Force in its Yehudi Lights project. The technology was developed by the U.S. Navy from 1943 onwards to enable a sea search aircraft to approach a surfaced submarine to within 30 seconds of flying time before becoming visible to the submarine's crew. The principle of counter-illumination survived, transplanted from ships to aircraft, where the geometry was simpler and the engineering challenges, while still significant, were more manageable. For the Royal Canadian Navy, the decision to wind down the diffused lighting program was not a rejection of the science. It was a recognition that the science had been overtaken by events. The Battle of the Atlantic was being won, not by any single innovation, but by the cumulative effect of dozens of improvements, each contributing its fraction to the shift in the balance of power. Diffused lighting camouflage was one of those contributions. A small one, limited in scale and brief in duration, but genuine. The program never received the recognition that its innovation warranted. It was classified during the war and quietly filed away afterward. The corvettes that carried the system were decommissioned or returned to standard configuration. The lamp, projectors were removed and scrapped. The control circuits were disassembled. The photocells were packed into crates and stored in warehouses where they gathered dust. And the principle, the beautiful counterintuitive principle that you could make a warship invisible by making it glow, slipped into the margins of naval history, remembered by specialists and forgotten by almost everyone else. The lesson of diffused lighting camouflage transcends the specific technology. It is a lesson about perception as a theater of war. Every weapon system, from the most primitive to the most advanced, depends on a targeting sequence. First, you detect the target. Then you classify it. Then you track it. Then you engage it. If any step in this sequence fails, the weapon cannot function. The entire apparatus of destruction, the torpedo, the gun, the bomb, is useless without the information that tells it where to go. Detection is the first and most critical step. And in the mid-20th century, at sea, at night, detection was primarily visual. The eye was the sensor. The brain was the processor. Contrast was the signal. Disrupt the signal, and the entire sequence collapsed. This is what diffused lighting camouflage accomplished. It did not destroy the submarine. It did not damage the torpedo. It did not jam a radar or decrypt a code. It attacked the first link in the chain, the moment, when the human eye registered the target's presence and broke it. Without detection, there was no classification. Without classification, there was no tracking. Without tracking, there was no firing solution. The submarine could be 50 meters away and armed with a full complement of torpedoes, and if it could not see the escort, those torpedoes were inert. The broader principle is that every sensor has vulnerabilities. The eye is vulnerable to contrast manipulation. Radar is vulnerable to jamming and deception. Sonar is vulnerable to sound absorption and thermal layering. Every method of detecting the enemy carries implicit assumptions about the physical environment, and every one of those assumptions can be attacked. What the Canadian researchers understood, perhaps instinctively, was that the submarine's night advantage was not inherent. It was not a property of the submarine itself. It was a property of the visual environment, the contrast conditions that made the escort visible, and the submarine invisible. Change the environment, and the advantage disappeared. The submarine had not become weaker. The escort had not become stronger. But the information gap, the asymmetry of perception that made the night a German weapon, had been closed. This is a radical idea, not in the technological sense, but in the conceptual one. The war was being fought with guns and torpedoes and depth charges and bombs, all of them designed to damage physical structures. Diffused lighting camouflage was designed to damage an abstraction, the enemy's ability to perceive, to know, to see. It was a weapon aimed not at steel, but at the mind behind the periscope. And in that sense, it was ahead of its time. Electronic warfare, stealth technology, information operations, all of the disciplines that would define late 20th and early 21st century conflict rest on the same foundation. The understanding that perception is a vulnerability, and that controlling what the enemy sees or does not see is as powerful as controlling what the enemy suffers. A group of Canadian scientists working in Halifax laboratories and on the decks of tiny corvettes arrived at this understanding in 1941. They did not have the language for it. They did not have a doctrine. They had a principle, a set of lamps, and a problem that was killing their sailors. They built a weapon out of light. and the weapon worked. Canada's National Research Council during the Second World War was a remarkable institution operating under extraordinary constraints. Canada was a great center of wartime research. The National Research Council, the armed forces, and various crown corporations undertook research in weapons, atomic energy, radar, nutrition, medicine, and other areas which both helped win the battle and improved the life and well-being of people in the years that followed. The NRAC's wartime portfolio was staggeringly diverse. Extensive research on magnetism was conducted to learn how to degauss or demagnetize the hulls of ships to protect them from some types of mines and to detect submerged submarines. The Canadian anti-acoustic torpedo gear was developed as a countermeasure to enemy acoustic torpedoes. This invention is credited with saving many ships from torpedo attacks. During the war's early years, Britain essentially passed all microwave radar development over to Canada. Canadian scientists developed the plan position indicator, still in use today. Canada provided some 9,000 radar sets, worth hundreds of millions of dollars, to the Allies. The scale of the contribution is difficult to overstate. In 1944 and 1945, the 300 National Research Council staff who were working on radar research had an average age of about 26. These were young men and women, many of them fresh from university, thrown into problems of life and death urgency and expected to produce results on timelines that peacetime research would have considered absurd. Diffused lighting camouflage was one thread in this broader tapestry. It was not the most consequential NRC project, nor the most widely deployed, but it may have been the most imaginative. It required its developers to think about the enemy's perception rather than the enemy's destruction, to work with light rather than explosives, to consider the physics of human vision rather than the physics of blast and fragmentation. The culture that produced this innovation was one of quiet, intense, practical problem-solving. Canadian wartime science did not seek glory. It did not announce its achievements with fanfare. Many of its breakthroughs remained classified for years or decades, and when they were eventually disclosed, they were noted in specialist journals and academic histories, not in the popular narratives of the war. This reticence was in some ways a reflection of Canadian character, or at least of the wartime version of it. The nation that built 123 corvettes and crewed them with reservists and volunteers was not a nation given to self-congratulation. The ships sailed. The convoys got through. The losses were mourned in private, and the innovations that helped tip the balance, the radar sets, the degaussing techniques, the anti-acoustic torpedoes, the diffused lighting camouflage, were done because they needed doing, and then filed away. What remains is the record, fragmentary and incomplete, of a scientific community that fought the war with its minds. That developed weapons the enemy never saw, not because they were secret, but because the weapon's entire purpose was to prevent seeing. That understood the Atlantic not just as a battlefield, but as a physical environment whose properties could be measured, manipulated, and turned against the aggressor. The NRC scientists who worked on diffused lighting camouflage did not fire a gun or drop a depth charge, but they may have saved lives that no one will ever count, on nights that no one will ever record, by making a Corvette fade into the sky over a dark ocean. Night had been German territory since the first Wolfpack attacks of 1940. The darkness was not a neutral condition. It was an asymmetric advantage, embedded in the physics of vision and the geometry of the sea surface, that favored the submarine in every engagement. The U-boat commander owned the night because the night gave him information and denied it to his opponent. He could see, the escorts could not. Diffused lighting camouflage did not reverse this asymmetry entirely. It did not make the escorts invisible in all conditions, at all times, against all observers, but it introduced something that had not existed before: doubt. Before diffused lighting, a submarine commander scanning the horizon could trust what he saw. If the sea was empty, it was empty. If a silhouette appeared, it was real. The visual environment was stable and predictable, governed by physics that the commander understood even if he could not articulate it. The night sky was brighter than the sea. Ships were darker than the sky. Contrast was reliable. Targeting was certain. After diffused lighting, that certainty eroded. The possibility that a ship might be present but invisible, that the empty horizon might contain a warship whose sides glowed with the brightness of the sky behind it, was enough to change the calculus. A commander who had to consider whether his eyes were being deceived was a commander who attacked with less confidence, approached with more caution, and broke off with less information. The erosion of confidence was subtle and cumulative. It was not caused solely by diffused lighting. It was caused by radar, which revealed submarines that thought they were hidden, by HF/DF, which turned radio transmissions into targeting data, by ultra-intelligence, which read the submarine's orders before they were received, by improved escort tactics, which closed the gaps in the screen and reduced the windows of vulnerability, and by diffused lighting, which suggested that even the most fundamental German advantage, the ability to see the enemy in the dark, might no longer be reliable. Together, these developments accomplished something that no single weapon could. They made the night uncertain. The submarine commander who once drove his boat toward a convoy with the calm assurance that darkness would cover his approach, now had to wonder whether the darkness was still his ally. The escorts might be invisible. They might be watching on radar. They might already be turning toward him. The night that once felt like a shield now felt like a curtain, and he could not be sure what was behind it. This psychological reversal was as important as any tactical advantage. The Wolfpack doctrine depended on aggressive, close-range attacks by surfaced submarines. Aggression required confidence. Confidence required information. And information, for the submarine commander, began with the eye. Undermine the eye's reliability, and you undermined the entire chain. The Canadian researchers who designed diffused lighting camouflage may not have thought in these terms. They were solving a physics problem, not a psychology problem. But the effect was the same. By attacking contrast, they attacked confidence. By making a corvette fade into the sky, they made the night a less certain place. And uncertainty, in the arithmetic of submarine warfare, was the beginning of defeat. Return to the image that began this story. A German U-boat commander, eyes pressed to his periscope, scanning the Atlantic horizon on a dark night. The sky is faintly luminous, the sea is black, and between them there should be a shape, the angular silhouette of a Canadian corvette, broadside to his approach, target-rich and unaware. But there is nothing. The horizon is unbroken. The sky meets the sea in a smooth, continuous gradient of near darkness. And nowhere in that gradient is there an edge, a shadow, a solid form that resolves into a warship. The commander adjusts the periscope. He scans again. He trusts his training, his experience, his eyes. The sea is empty. It was not empty. The corvette was there, 3,000 yards off his beam, making 12 knots on a steady heading, her hull washed in a soft blue-green glow that matched the sky behind her with uncanny precision. 60 lamp projectors, fed by a dedicated alternator, regulated by photocells, filtered through blue-green. Glass had raised the brightness of her steel sides to the exact luminance of the night. The contrast that should have betrayed her presence had been erased. The silhouette that should have given the commander his firing solution had dissolved. The corvette existed in the same visual space as the sky itself, a warship that had stopped casting a shadow. This was not science fiction. This was not a theoretical exercise. This was a real system, built by real engineers, fitted to real ships, and tested in the real Atlantic in the darkest years of the war. It was born from a chance observation on a snowy December night near Montreal, developed in laboratories and dockyards from Halifax to St. Margaret's Bay, and carried to sea on corvettes that rolled and pitched and shuddered their way across the most dangerous ocean on Earth. It was fragile. It was weather-dependent. It was overtaken by radar before it could be deployed at scale. It never entered mass production. It never became a standard issue system. And it was forgotten, buried in classified files and specialist footnotes, while the larger narratives of the Battle of the Atlantic focused on radar, ultra, the wolf packs, the convoy battles, and the men who fought them. But for a brief window in 1943, on certain nights, under certain conditions, a Canadian corvette could vanish, not by hiding in the dark, not by running silent, not by any of the conventional methods of concealment that navies had practiced for centuries, by glowing, by matching the sky, by becoming, for a few hours, not a ship on the water, but a piece of the night itself, by turning the U-boat's most fundamental advantage, the contrast between hull and horizon, into an illusion that could be controlled, manipulated, and dissolved. The Canadian ideas were adapted by the U.S. Air Force in its Yehudi Lights project. The principles survived. Counter-illumination would find its way into aircraft camouflage, into stealth research, into the long, quiet evolution of technologies designed to control what the enemy perceives. The roots of modern low observable design reach back, through many branching paths, to a professor watching an airplane disappear over snow. In the Atlantic, Canada did not just fight submarines. It rewrote what the eye could see.